Do we all have juggle boards or something like a juggle board?
Yes.
If you don't have a juggle board, you can sort of imitate a lot of the activities with any spatial sequencing map. So if even if you wanted to do these activities with just numbers on the table, you could that way as well. And that might be one of the strategies you use in the future for practicing. But if you have a juggle board, it's going to make it a lot more relevant. Like the learning process will make a lot more sense. Cool. So yeah, so have your juggle boards ready today. Because today we're going to be looking at the primary composition and understanding a little bit more about the flow state stimulation, which is a term that is synonymous now for global activation. In an academic setting, I might refer to this as global activation. In a circus convention, I would refer to it as flow state. Um, but we know that that's going to be a byproduct of the experience of juggling. And our primary composition takes that into consideration as well. And our facilitation techniques, everything now is going to be designed and focused around facilitating the experience of juggling, right? Because we deconstructed and reconstructed its idea with spatial sequencing maps, theory of process formations. Now it's going to be all about how do we apply these concepts. So the structure, same as yesterday, review topics, presentation of new materials, application of activities, and then feedback and recap. There's not a creative side, so you don't have like a creative assignment today because it's more technical. Today is more about learning the steps to this choreography and reflecting on why it's structured the way that it is and what potentials it gives us. And then next week, next Tuesday, when you guys come back, we're going to talk more about its nonverbal communication strategies. And how we facilitate. And then I don't need to read these two notes because you just heard this yesterday, but just a reminder. I think this is more relevant when I don't see you for a week, but I just saw you yesterday, so I don't have to remind you that even though everything is technical, the ultimate goal is to make this playful and fun, right? Yesterday, it should be still pretty fresh. We looked at the idea of spatial sequencing maps, which probably we were already familiar with, but maybe we didn't use this terminology. And you see this concept appear in other disciplines as well, particularly in dance. It's very similar to that concept, to many teaching strategies that we use in dance. And the idea is to create an environment in which we can start to apply and explore our relationships with juggling. And those relationships be in those four sequencing relationships of synchronous lateral, synchronous bilateral, and asynchronous bilateral. Um, an important element of this with all of our theories is that we are constantly trying to find ways to indicate where and when our experiences with juggling occur, but not to describe the how part. It's the how part that makes it inaccessible. So our goal is always to achieve that. Anytime you come up with an idea that allows you to think about something that doesn't describe its action, you just figured out how to make that thing accessible. Um, we can use any number of points. Here in the juggle board, we're using 5. It's going to start to make more sense when we get into the facilitation strategies. But in general, we know that 5 is, if you're going to create and you're going to play with people, you know that with 5 points structured with 1 on the midline and then evenly distributed on either side, you know you can get access all the different sequencing relationships. If you work with less than 5, you start to lose that. I find 6 points is also, this is a side note, this is like, I find 6 points is also really cool for a lot of people because there the structures are simpler, but because they're working with more objects, you can get the stimulation higher. And it's really easy. Like if you imagine you had 6 lanes and you started off with like a pattern 1 variation, think about the stimulation, boom, 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 boom. And if you did it asynchronous, it's boom, 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 high level stimulation. So if you're ever working with like high functioning kids or like, they don't have the patience to sit down, you don't always have to start at the bottom. It's about starting where they are. So understanding how to like expand these ideas in either direction is really important because we tend to focus more on the accessibility side, but accessibility includes providing the appropriate level of challenge for people who have higher level capacity as well. That's part of accessibility. So the idea of this model is it can scale up or it can scale down. And in terms of points that we interact with and complexity of dimensions as well, right? Because we don't have to interact on one plane. We don't have to interact in one dimension. And then we talked about, or we introduced this idea, the grammar, the structure of prop swap notation yesterday, which there are a lot of little tiny rules that add up. But I think when you see the whole thing and you associate the notation to the visual process of doing the task. It's not so complicated. And I don't think there was anyone in this group that showed any difficulty with it. So it might be that I'm either getting better at teaching at it, or maybe having the book helps. I don't know, but I'm finding it in general with these presentations, that the notation part it's normally been a challenge for us in the seminars. People get very confused with it, and in these online courses we haven't had any challenges. So I don't think I need to repeat so much about this. It's pretty obvious. I think the key things is to talk about is its intentions or its benefits for us, its values for us. You're going to really see its value today when we look at the composition, because now we're talking about a choreography that takes us about 10 minutes to get through. Like, having a way to memorize that or notate that, if I wanted to share it with you, is going to require notation. So today you'll see the benefits. And then we looked at applied transformations. So this was taking the idea from the previous week, where we looked at the functional applications. We played with 4-point sequencing maps last week, and we were really focused on the ability to create varied movements and context for those movements, because the second part of the functional element of this term, functional juggling, involves using juggling as a platform for other intentions. And those intentions tend to be they're not limited to, but in a lot of situations that they revolve around juggling's ability to produce time on task and repetition. So our ability to use juggling as a way to animate other people now becomes a very valuable asset. And we took a look at that. You made your own spatial sequencing maps, and then you wrote down your compositions as well. But in these examples that we were playing with, keep in mind that they're static. And anytime you're doing a static interaction, then you don't have the sensory feedback to stimulate, to encourage movement. It would be like the idea of playing with static. It's like trying to dance without music versus trying to dance with music, right? It's a much different experience. So when we interact with objects that move, we have a natural motivation. The person's body is going to have an impulse to keep moving. When we interact with static interactions, sometimes we have to be more creative, which is why I emphasize the need for narrative-based play or something. Narrative-based play is very flexible term. Narrative-based could be sound effects, it could be sensory-based. It doesn't have to be a story. But that's going to become more important when you're working in only static. Once you start to play with objects that are in motion, then it's like turning on music, because you'll understand more and more how that sense of motion creates our sense of time. So today's topics, we are going to be looking at the primary composition, which I'm pretty sure all of us have an idea of. I don't know if you've ever seen a video of it before, but it takes about 10 or 12 minutes to facilitate on average. And it has a couple intentions. It has a few intentions. And we're going to do a walkthrough training of the entire composition and analysis of its components today. And it's a really what it is. It's sort of like the it's a beautiful application of the theory of process formation. So after understanding the theory of process formations and then starting to facilitate this way, I started to discover different things, like how I was able to communicate and keep the activities moving without interruption. And I started to structure these patterns in a way that made the learning process as natural as possible for as many people. And that's what I came up with, the primary composition. It's been tested and used all around the world. It works so well, but it does take time and practice to be able to deliver. So at this point in the seminar, you should be thinking of these things like learning a new discipline. If you want to be able to facilitate the primary composition, you have to think of that as like, I want to learn to ride a unicycle. Like, it's a new skill. You're going to have to put time in to train it. The good news is, if you do, you are going to be able to trigger states of flow for other people. So that's a pretty cool thing. We're going to be looking more at the facilitation techniques of this composition in tomorrow's class, because those are really, it's about creating sensory dialogues. And in order to do that, first we have to look at the choreography itself. So today's going to be more focused on the choreography and not the sensory communication of it. But we do have to set up a few like basic primary conditions for how the communication is going to work. And that involves us talking about like how we produce our tempo and what hand positioning we use when we interact, because we view this tool now as sensory feedback for ourselves, right? When a student sends us an object, that's information that we can collect with our body. And we're going to talk about how we want to interact with the object so we can get more of that information. and then break down this tactile communication structure and how we're able to influence and regulate another person's sense of tempo and even emotional reactions to the juggling experience itself. And through all of this, if we are successful in delivering the primary composition, then we are going to start to notice a change in people's behaviors throughout. So it becomes a very predictable path of behavior that you observe in your participants, where they come in smooth, things are going easy, you build up with a little bit of resistance, there's some peaks, and then you push them to a limit where their brain is no longer able to process that amount of information linearly. And in that moment, we observe a dramatic change in their behavior that lets us know, because the information they're giving me, right? We talk about balanced frequency a lot. When a person is managing a pattern and its frequency is imbalanced, I'm detecting imbalanced forces and imbalanced time. That lets me know that they have not harmonized the sequence, right? That they're still trying to process it in a linear way, which is why they're not able to get an equal balance between all forces. And we find this in the composition. There's moments where people stop resisting, where it goes from resistance and it just becomes completely fluid. And at that moment, it changes their learning curve. Once we're able to trigger this altered state of mind, we need to be aware of how that affects the learning process so we can continue to keep stimulating the person as well. Because once this state of mind opens, the amount of information they can consume explodes. Ready? Maybe. Primary composition. The primary composition is a radically effective means for developing a person's sequencing capacity well beyond what is needed to manage the expression of a three-ball tossing cascade. So like on day one, we looked at that classical model of teaching juggling, and I actually showed you my 5-step alternative, which is helpful. But in reality, like, there's even better ways to go about this, if we're willing to play an abstract juggling this way, right? So what we're going to end up doing is, in a single setting, the first time we sit down with someone, we are going to take them through the entire spectrum of experiences with juggling, meaning their brains are going to learn the different sequence and frequencies of all these relationships. And they're going to do it while processing external sensory feedback information, while having to balance those sequences with external feedback information. That's going to produce an experience of juggling that goes way beyond the cognitive challenge of a three-ball tossing cascade. So that later on, if I want my students to do a three-ball tossing cascade, say that was my goal, not always, but the only thing I have to develop then is going to be the motor control. So it produces a situation. It's the same as going from balls to rings to clubs now. If we can get them to experience the cascade sequence and manage it here in these environments, then it's just changing the motor control. That's it. So that, if I were to begin this composition with students that were 5 years old, because at 5 years old, the motor control to throw and catch really isn't there. But in my circus school, everyone under 7 is playing, with juggling. They're managing really complex sequences, even Mills mess, like 5-year-olds can manage. And their brains are so ready, so that later on, when they're 7, 8, or 9, and they start throwing things and catching them, they juggle, they toss juggle, right? And as their motor control develops, they get more and more ways to create juggling with. So this is like, it's the foundation. The primary composition is the fastest way to take people through all of these relationships, and also to do it in a way that's accessible as well. There's a lot of thought put into that. So making sure that we take them through the processes in the right order, and then also making sure that it's able to be delivered and communicated to everyone. So it takes the theory of process formations and applies its transformations to the systematic capacity development of each participant's personal experience. That means, like, what it's going to do is we're going to see this repetition of structure. We condition relationships with space using synchronous lateral, and then we ask the person to change one element of that relationship. So going to asynchronous, we dissect all the conditions, and then we introduce them separately so that we can then get the person to interchange between them, so to gain a fluency. So in order to be fluency in this new language, you need to apply it, and we're going to look at how the composition builds up to that. It is intended, but not required, to be facilitated non-verbally and with as little interruption to engagement as possible. So You're not required to deliver nonverbally, but we're going to talk about why that's a better way to deliver it and why you'll have more success and you'll develop more things that way. But it is always the intention to do this with as little engagement to the interaction as possible, because our means of communication is going to become rhythm or frequency. So in order to have that, we need constant interaction. That's why we have to create compositions. We need to be prepared for what we're going to do before we do it, right? Because our goal is to constantly keep the person exchanging objects with me. If they stop to exchange objects with me, I lose my communication strategy. So that's why it's important that we're able to facilitate these with as little interruption as possible. And then the nonverbal element, I think, we talked about as well, giving instructions is not helpful for juggling in general. And we tend to find that if you're working with like populations that are disabled or young students, children, we don't find much resistance to this technique. But you will tend to find, if you do find resistance to this technique, it's going to be from high functioning adults, people who have been conditioned to a learning environment in which answers are given and they respond. So when you sit down and you play with high functioning adults and you don't tell them what to do, it can make them very anxious. And in those situations, I encourage you to keep maintain nonverbal facilitation, because if you can get them to go through that process with you, you can sort of open their minds to this idea as well, that not all learning has to be structured that way. But yeah, we'll get more into the nonverbal as well, but it's also intended to be for accessibility too. So it's to enhance the quality of the learning, but also for accessibility to make sure I can communicate with everyone. And I travel the world. I work with people who are verbal, nonverbal, and most often speak different languages than me. I don't think I've been in an English-speaking country now in 4 years. And I still teach juggling to everyone because I was so focused on doing it non-verbally from the start. And then the emphasis of the composition is, first it's going to be about unpacking its technique. So like I said, we have to, it takes training, it takes practice. But then once we have this choreography, once we know it, it's in our bodies, then we can start to focus on its social, emotional, and like sensory integrated learning strategies and experiences, because that takes a lot of attention. It's a lot of focus. When I'm facilitating, I'm concentrating so hard, but none of it is on what I'm doing. It's all on what the other person is doing, so that I can constantly respond to what they need. Like that's the type of facilitation we're doing now. And I observe that people who learn this composition at first, like just applying its steps, it's the same as the 5-step model. If you go and you apply those steps, just technically, you're going to see an improvement, right? You're going to see faster development. But it's when you learn to apply it socially as a social and emotional tool that you're able to work with everyone. That's what takes it to another level, because we talked about how learning to juggle isn't a physical risk, but it is an emotional risk. And now what we can start to do, because we're exchanging so much information with our participants physically, we can start to interpret their emotional responses to juggling, right? So if someone is calm with their movements and then suddenly they get very tense, it's an indication, of an emotional response as well. And we can take that information, we can learn to regulate it for them. So if someone gives me anxiety, I can give them back a calm. If they put a stressed output, I give back a calm input. And I keep repeating that calm input until their body starts to mimic it. So it's sensory feedback loops that we're creating. And that's sensory feedback, that type of physical sensory feedback, we process a lot consciously as emotion. Think about like anger, sadness, happiness. How do we really process those ideas with our bodies? Cool. So before I start to show you the composition, I want to point out one structure to the notation that is a little bit different than the things we saw before. And this is called a transition beat. And a transition beat is something we use during the composition just to get from one pattern to another without stopping, because not all patterns can you go in between. And the only place you're going to see this in the composition or any of our facilitations is in between pattern 3 and 4. So if you see here, that the way that it works is all the patterns we're going to facilitate until we feel a sense of harmonization from our student, right? So I do the repetitions, depends on how long it takes the person to start to harmonize with that pattern. So we never know how many times we're going to repeat, but it's usually in a certain range for each person. But when we're doing a transition beat, we just do it once. We're not trying to condition that. That's not a pattern we're conditioning. It's just to get from one place to another. And you see it here playing. The way that you'll see it written in the composition is with a letter T in front. And when you're going from pattern 3 to pattern 4, you can either do it by using a 41 or a 15. It doesn't matter. Either one works. And then you can start pattern 4 or pattern 3 from any point, right? It could be 42, 35, or it could be 35, 42, right? It doesn't matter which order I go into the pattern. So that's the one thing that you're going to see that's new today. Clear? Super clear. Great. Whew. So this is something we got to break down in layers because it's a lot of information. So I'm going to walk through now. We're going to do a walkthrough of the entire composition. We're going to look at its elements and reflect on its structure and the impacts, right? And then we're going to go and we're going to break down some of its sections afterwards where you guys will actually do some of these things so you can become more aware of them. But I'm not going to take you through all of this composition. You're going to be responsible for practicing all of it on your own, right? My goal is to highlight the whole structure, give you guys the goals and the intentions, and then let you apply that in some of the sections as well. So we have those ideas, and then you can go start your learning process. You know, so this is really just intended to begin your learning process of this idea. Okay, the primary composition, it breaks down into 3 parts. We have 3 sections to this composition, and each section is intended to develop a different capacity. It's like focused on a different relationship or a different element of the juggling. The 3 sections is we start off in a forward fixed arrangement, meaning the balls don't change lanes, and I'm exchanging them with you. And in that situation, we're going to be really focused on developing the sequencing relationships of juggling. Our first goal is to take through that arrangement, we'll take them through all the sequencing relationships. Then when we go into the open state, when the objects start to change hands, at that point, we're not focused on introducing new relationships. We're focused on challenging the existing ones. And the way that we do that is because the motor control movement is more complex, it requires more information to process, right? So picking up a ball and moving it to another location requires more information than just pushing the ball back to you, right? It's a more complex task. So the person is going to have to process the same sequencing task, but with more information. And then because we're able to add more objects into those activities, we shorten how much time they have to process it. So if you can remember on day 2, when we talked about the corpus callosum, and I said about how time is going to be our resistance. So now, you know, we're giving them these sequencing relationships, and then we're able to reduce how much time they have to process them and increase how much information they're processing at the same time. So shortening, section 2 is for shortening the time and increasing motor complexity. And then section 3 is horizontal, and that's the only thing we're looking to develop there is emotional independence and self-regulation of the juggling. So that's when we ask them to play on their own. And in that situation, the only thing that gets in our way is the sensory overload. If they're not able to manage that sensory dialogue on their own, because prior to that, we are responsible for all their physical information. In the first section and the second section, we regulate the information for them. In the last section, we're asking them to regulate the information themselves. Okay, so do you see now, you get an idea like how much thought and structure is put into this? Like each section is going to address a certain relationship, and we're going to build this way for independence. The ultimate goal is independence. And we want them to be able to sequence a 3-ball, not a 3-ball, a 5. We're going to end with them sequencing a 5-ball cascade in the horizontal position, because that will what is the word? Stimulate? No. Virtualize the sensation of a 3-ball tossing cascade as well. So, boom. Section 1 now is the forward fixed state. I'm going to talk about the intentions. We'll look at the structure, and then there's a video on this slide as well. So what are our intentions at this phase of development? We just sat down, we have a new person, they never experienced juggling before. My first intention is exposure and management of the total possible sequencing relationships with space and time. I want to develop their bilateral sequencing relationships that they can have, right? Because that's what juggling is about. And then I also want to introduce them to an ability to collect and start to learn to harmonize with external sensory feedback information that they gain through touch. These are my 2 goals right now. The way that I'm going to achieve that is I'm going to, for the sequencing relationships, you see the notation on this side, how the composition is broken down. We break down the patterns by formation. So we have a structure of formations that increases in complexity and challenge. And then we have a structure of patterns that also increase in complexity and have different spatial demands for us. So you see in the first synchronous lateral here, the patterns are ordered in number of challenge. We move up through them, synchronous lateral, and down. At this stage of interaction, we are able to condition the person's relationship with all of these locations in space. So their body becomes familiar with all of these spatial relationships as they're doing it. We are conditioning them to learn these patterns. Once they have those spatial relationships, we change to asynchronous. And now, so their body's already familiar with moving to these locations in space in this order, and we're just asking them to change the relationship with time. That's why this is so effective. That's why it works, you know, because they've done it. We separated those two relationships. And then you see in the asynchronous lateral, we do the same thing. We go pattern 1, pattern 2, pattern 3, pattern 4, and then we end on pattern 5. Pattern 5 is a 5-period pattern, right? It's a pattern that definitely requires lateral and bilateral movements. But we haven't reached a point in our composition yet where we have conditioned bilateral behavior. So people often point this out. Why do we introduce pattern 5 at the end of asynchronous lateral? We do it as an evaluation, because some people will actually perform it. If you introduce this to them now, they can actually do it without doing the next part of the composition. It does happen. But really what I'm doing is I want to expose them to it so they can get familiar with it for one time, but I don't expect them to perform it properly. And I'm evaluating how well they perform it, because that's going to give me an indication how much conditioning I need to do in the next steps. So the reason we put pattern 5 here is to introduce it, because it is really complex. So to give the person a chance to play with it, but we expect them to fail. And usually what I do when I introduce that pattern 5, that last time at this point, I tend to increase the tempo all the way up until the person does fail. So we break tempo. Because at the next part for the synchronous bilateral, to introduce that, I have to take a really quick pause to gesture to you the behavior, because we're changing the behavior. So after I finish pattern 5, asynchronous lateral, I let the ball stop and I quickly gesture. We use gesture and we get the person to do the behavior with us, and then we continue our composition. There's a couple moments where we need to take short pauses to communicate a new behavior, but it's really easy in this environment because there's so much mirroring going on already. The people respond to gesture so well. Then you'll see that the synchronous bilateral comes in, and you'll notice that the bilateral part is shorter than the lateral part, right? Why? Because every step of the way too, we're getting more and more focused on which thing we're trying to develop. We don't need to redevelop. That's the beauty of this strategy. Every layer builds on top of the other. So each section gets shorter and shorter because we're narrowing in on the challenges that are harder and harder. So with the bilateral, it's just about conditioning them to have those interactions with space, to encourage them to cross their midline. Once they get into that rhythm synchronous, they'll have a tendency and an impulse to cross their midline before they actually see the ball, before there's a reason for them to do it, right? So that impulsive movement then is very easy to transition to asynchronous bilateral. It's how we trick them into making that as well. So painting a picture here, you can kind of get the understanding now of, you know, we know these relationships are different. We know they have different challenges, but imagine now this development strategy and how a person going through that, how natural that's going to be, because we structured it this way. And now let's start to take a look at those steps. That was super fast. So as you see, we start off with pattern 1 now. Now we talk about pattern number and formation. Pattern 1, synchronous lateral, formation 1. Then we do pattern 2. We start to get them to develop a relationship with their midline. They keep alternating which hand touches their midline, right? Then we go pattern 3. Now we're asking them to process reflected symmetry. So their brains are starting to communicate. It's stimulating their brain to communicate more visually as well. And then we use a transition beat and we go to pattern 4, which causes, technically, it's a midline cross, right? But in reality, even you see my body behavior here, I just shift my weight. So it's not actually crossing the midline yet, but it's still conditioning the hand positionings in space, right? Then in the synchronous lateral, we actually work our way back down through pattern 3, 2, and then back to the position of 1, because we're trying to get more repetition at that stage. Let me pause this. The reason you see that redundancy in the first stage of the composition is we want to get more repetition with conditioning of the space. You know, sometimes we move on to asynchronous and the person doesn't respond, and usually the solution is to go back and condition the relationship with space more. So it's helpful to do a little bit more repetition at this stage. But then after that, you don't see that repetitiveness again. Then it just becomes linear. And then the idea is we apply the same relationships asynchronous. There are quite a few moments in the composition that become very predictable where we know students are going to have challenges. And that's another beauty of using a composition as well, because we can start to be prepared for those particular moments and we can come up with teaching strategies. So all of the challenges that we tend to see in this composition as well, we're going to break down and look at how to solve. And it tends to come whenever you're asking a person to transition from one formation to another, right? When you ask a person to change their relationship with time, there's a chance to lose them. When you ask them to change their relationship with space, those are where the challenges appear, and we have strategies for that. I mean, the composition itself is a strategy for that, right? Because it conditions each relationship. For pattern, if you notice here, this is important. When we introduce, I told you there's going to be a quick pause and we need to introduce it, the synchronous bilateral behavior. You see pattern 1, we only use the center 2 lanes. It's 23, 32, because crossing to the 45 is really big. And especially if you're working with young children, it's not needed. And also what we're doing in that moment of introducing just the 2 balls is that's also the moment that we're communicating the behavior. So usually I'll gesture to the person to cross their arms, and then I'll roll them the 2 balls, and I'll get them to roll back to me the 2 balls. And then as their balls are rolling to me, then I'll show them another gesture to cross, and I'll repeat. So be aware that it's helpful to use the 23 and the 32 to communicate that new behavior, and then you go right into the other patterns. As soon as I see the person is doing the behavior I want, I go right into the pattern. But I use that pattern 1 to communicate those ideas. So we're going to break down these sections like more specifically. And in the book, I talk about this as well, like practice structures, because it's a lot of information. It's really good for you to practice each section, each formation. Learn, like just like you would with a dance. If you had a 10-minute long dance, you're not going to start learning it all the way through, like linearly, right? You're going to learn different sections that relate to different choruses in the music. So that's the idea. Like think of it this way. Learn the choreography for each section, and then you'll be able to like develop them and put them together. And because they do follow this very logical repetitiveness, it becomes intuitive as well, the more you do it. But it is going to be important that this becomes like, you know, a dance that you can do with your eyes closed. You saw in that last one how we structured them each differently, the 4 different relationships. And then when we got to the asynchronous bilateral, we ended with pattern 5 again. So pattern 5 comes in twice. And the second time around, we expect them to do it, because at that point, they're in the middle, they're already doing the bilateral behavior. So they go to pattern 5 without noticing any change. And the reason pattern 5 is important, those structures, is because it's causing the person to interchange between formations within one sequence, right? That's showing me that the person now has fluency with these relationships as well. Not just that they can manage each separately, but that they can have fluency, right? Is another level of development. So that being said, now we know that we've taken the person through the spectrum of sequence and relationships. The only ones we didn't do were disassociated, right? But that's really easy to add later. So what we're going to be focused on now is optimizing their performance level with those sequence and relationships. And the way we do that is we have 2 ways to do that. We can increase the amount of information they have to process, which means increasing the complexity of their movement. And we can reduce how much time they have to process that information. So that's going to be the primary goals of this second part. Increased motor control complexity of existing sequence and task through introduction of grasp and release technique, which is also mirroring of the throw and the catch. So it means more complex information. Oops. And then decrease the amount of time that is available to process each sequence. So that corpus callosum region, now you can imagine what's going on in there. It's having to communicate so much information with less and less time. What is it going to start to do? It's going to start to look for new ways, new pathways, right? And it won't do that unless it has this demand. And there's not many linear tasks that we can do that can create that level of demand. This is why we play these games. You know, it's like the same reason we eat vegetables. It becomes a biological need. So let's look at the actual application. And maybe I'll stick with this idea here. So you see, it's just a constant repetition. Reinforcement is why the composition gets shorter and shorter. So we start off with pattern 1, and it's open state now. So it's 23:45, 23:45, and then we do pattern 2, and that's getting them to change on that midline. And then we go back to pattern 1 again. You see we use this, now we're using that conditioning structure again. We want more time on task. And the thing is, with the open state, there's less patterns here too. So you'll see more repetition when I play open state because there's not as much variation and I still need repetition. These examples are with 2 balls, but most commonly in facilitation, we use 6. It's, you know, because at 6, then you have, with 4, you're maintaining that balanced tempo where none of the events are overlapping, right? I do something at the same time that you do something. When you get to 6 balls in these activities, then there's events that are happening in between us. And that's causing the person to be aware more of having to process other frequencies than the ones they're dealing with at that moment, right? So that's when we get into another layer of processing here, where I'll add in that other object as well. And then we go to asynchronous. And this part of the composition is divided into 2 parts. The first part, the participant is given the 2 and the 3 position. They always respond the same. And it's important that the student doesn't have a choice here. We want them to be reactive. We don't want them to be decision making. So by giving them only the 2 and the 3 position at the beginning, we're able to develop certain patterns with space and certain relationships. And then we do another pause, and we use gesture because there would be another pause in the composition here, because anytime you have to communicate a change in behavior, you were just rolling the balls back and forth to me. Now I want you to change lanes. And again, it's just gesture. It's super easy. It's super quick. It takes 3 seconds to show someone that you want them to change lanes. It's really easy. So just be aware of that. And you're showing them the first time, you're showing them to always put the balls in the 2 and the 3. And the second time, you're showing them to always put the ball in the 1. And there's benefits and there's reasons for that. So at that point, they only have one choice. And what happens is, if you watch the students' hands in these formations, it's basically just asking them to touch every sequencing point we just developed and then return that to their midline. So it's 2, midline 3, midline 4, midline 5, midline. We are getting the brain focused on and comfortable with bilateral spatial relationships by getting that constant repetition. Reach lateral, bring it to the midline. Reach lateral, bring it to the midline. And then we design the composition in a way that then gets them to cross the midline. And we do that by using odd number of beats on different sides of the body, because we know we have that, you know, we talked about the periods being even or odd. That's how we manipulate this behavior to cross the midline then. So we end with a pattern that this is Mills mass. This is 3 beats to one side of the body, followed by 3 beats to the other side of the body. And we often do this with 5 or more balls with people who, as long as they don't have physical limitations, a 7-year-old will do this with 5 balls, no problem. Every 7-year-old I sit down with does this with 5 balls, no problem. If you learn the composition, you know, and maybe it seems crazy to think that within 8 minutes of sitting down with a 7-year-old, you could have them processing a 5-ball Mills Mess sequence, right? That sounds insane. But if you look at how we're getting there, if you look at these steps, it doesn't sound so crazy anymore, right? Because it's a model of learning that's layered, and it's constant experience. At which point in this technique are they not gaining sensory feedback information about it? Right? Going back to like the idea of the trapeze. When you're on the trapeze, you're learning trapeze. Here, if you're playing, you're learning, even if you're making mistakes, right? So we've created an environment now. This is the training wheels of juggling. But in order to add in that extra safety element is where we come in as facilitators, right? So it's a safe environment for people to learn, but we as facilitators now, we come in and we bring that extra element of safety so that we guarantee success. But that's the idea at the end of that. And then when we go to the third section of the composition, we have developed their sequencing capacity so freaking crazy, right? Like every possible relationship you can manage. And we also applied it in a way that allowed to show that they had fluency as well, which means interchanging the Mills-Mess pattern. So there's nothing left to develop sequencing wise. They've exceeded the sequencing capacities of this next stage of development. So we went all the way up in the open state to this high level of sequencing capacity. And now when we move to the horizontal, we're going to reduce the sequencing challenge because we're focused now on developing a different thing, which is their ability to self-regulate all of the sensory feedback information of the experience themselves. Because once we're no longer involved in the activity, if those sensory that stress and that anxiety that is expressed as rapid movement or error, right? That when they feel stressed, it's expressed as incorrect error. And that incorrect error is going to cause a feedback stimulation when they receive it from the other hand, right? And then it works as an influence. So they start off like maybe calm and they very quickly get out of control. So that's the challenge that we're looking at, is trying to get the person to self-regulate their own sensory dialogue with juggling, which is why you see such a short composition and we're not really interested in sequencing now. It's super quick, it's super simple. It's more here, it's not the patterns that are complicated at all. It's just being aware of what our actual intention is here and how we're gonna facilitate this section a lot differently than the other two sections. So we're gonna look at this section more tomorrow than we are today, because we have alternative methods for dealing with this because we're hands off now. So the teaching strategies we have for the first two sections of the composition are not the same ones. They're similar, but that we can't use the same ones here because I have no way to give you tactile information. If this is like the design of the board, what I was aiming for with all the dimensions here was trying to create a situation in which a person would have to manage a cascade sequence, the same sequence and relationships as a cascade, while dealing with sensory feedback, having to harmonize with sensory feedback information from space on their own, but also trying to achieve about 120 beats per minute of that interaction. Because if you can do that, the average person, right, how many beats per minute do they do? You know, a cascade could be anywhere from like 120 to like, I don't know, 90 beats. If you juggle about like a 15, you know, about eye level, you're going to get boom, 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 boom. So if you think about the cascade, right, we have research. We know what the cascade does for people. It produces so much brain growth. And my theory is, well, if I can produce the same rate of sequencing, the same sequencing relationship, and the same sensory dialogue, it should produce the same result, no? So that's what I was aiming for in some of the dimensions here, just like a side note. When you get them processing the cascade sequence, managing all the sensory information themselves at a rate of 120 beats per minute, we've produced the same stimulation. And there's a lot of ways, though, when you get into this open state horizontal, there's so much material here where the juggling nerds can really start to have fun. And I think tomorrow we're going to look at that too, like strategies to take all of this, because there's two directions with all of it, right? Like maybe you want to just develop juggling. Like that's a big part of it. I don't focus on it so much in this seminar because that's already part of the conversation. I'm trying to open up this other light. But tomorrow I'm going to show us about how we can use all of this to just start making juggler factories, just pumping out jugglers so fast, toss jugglers as well. Cool. Okay, so for the next part, now that's the whole composition. We're going to go back through some of its sections and you're going to look at some of the strategies we're using. But before we do that, I told you we have to establish the baseline of our whole entire communication structure, right? Because it's nonverbal. And that nonverbalness is also what helps us regulate everything. The things I can do, communicate nonverbally, I cannot tell you with words, right? You're going to start to understand that here. So the idea is from the very beginning, when you're facilitating, your aim is always to maintain what we call a balanced tempo. A balanced tempo simply means that you are exchanging your objects at the same time as your student, and very importantly, you are using the same amount of force as your student. Because when you do this, what you do is you create a distortion. We create mirror tendencies, right? They're seeing visual mirroring, So it's causing them to imitate our behaviors as well. But you're also creating sensory distortion between their output information and their input information. So that when they start to feel like the information that they are putting out is the same as the information that they are getting back, then that really starts to activate the mirror neurons in their brain, which is going to cause them to want to imitate all of our sensory feedback information, right? And we're going to start to, this is how we establish the baseline. And it's this idea of meeting someone where they are too, because if I start a pattern with different people, I don't know what frequency is comfortable for them yet. So I always let them set the tempo. Yeah. And then I have an intention. I know which tempo I want to get to, but I begin with whatever tempo they give me, because that harmonization is having a sensory influence on them. It's establishing the means of our dialogue. So on the surface, it's a little bit basic. I want to explain this theory a little bit, because this is actually a phenomenon of physics that we can see applied in social situations as well. And we look at early childhood development strategies, we use this a lot. So it's a phenomenon known as spontaneous synchronization. Spontaneous synchronization is a remarkable collective effect observed in nature. When a population of oscillating units, right, we have a situation with oscillating units in it, right, juggling, which have diverse natural frequencies and are in weak interaction with one another, evolves to spontaneously exhibit collective oscillations at a common frequency. So we observe this in science here. You can see in the two examples. The first one is with pendulums or metronomes. And what you're going to see in this video is they initially start off at different frequencies. They all have their own frequency. But because they're on a vibrating surface, because they're rotating, there's a medium by which they can communicate their frequencies to each other. And what happens is frequencies that are close together will begin to influence each other gradually over time, so that maybe the two on the right start to sync up. And then that produces a stronger signal of frequency that influences the others, because there's a medium by which that frequency can be communicated, which is the vibrating table, right? We have a medium by which we can communicate frequency now as well, exchanging objects, controlling the force, the time of those objects. And then you end up with this phenomenon. What happens? So there's this thing in nature. We have this rule in nature, how similar frequencies, if there's a medium by which they can communicate, will influence each other to be the same. So then what we do is we start off from this position. We say, I'm going to harmonize with your frequency first, and then I'm going to change mine to influence yours. Does that make sense? You saw what happened there, right? That happens whether you want it to or not. Because if I'm clapping here, if I'm clapping at 60 beats per minute and I start to hear, I get feedback of someone who's clapping at 62 beats per minute, I start to move to 61 and then 62. And then because we're both clapping at 62 beats per minute, the person who's clapping at 65 starts to move to 64. So that you end up in a situation where everyone is clapping together. And if you just kept going, it would just keep cycling through. It would go through phases. People would harmonize and clap together. And then what's really interesting, if you noticed, the tempo, once everyone synchronizes, the tempo increases, because they begin that sensory feedback, they influence each other, and it goes up and up and up until it goes back into unsynchronized. That's what I mean. It goes in and out of phase, because there's no one to regulate that frequency. That's why it just keeps going out of control. And this is what we see happening in our facilitation techniques. And that's why it's so important that we learn how to communicate this spontaneous synchronization through touch. Because if you watch if you put two kids on a juggle board and you don't tell them about this and they start to play with each other, you'll watch the same thing happen. They're out of phase, they're not synchronized. And then at one moment, they'll discover a frequency together and they'll start to harmonize. But then because one of them uses more force than the other one responds back with more force, and back and forth, and it crescendos, and they stop to be able to maintain the pattern, right? So it's being aware of this influence, right? Also being aware of the risk of this influence to cause overstimulation. And we are now going to put ourselves in a position where we can regulate that. That's why it's important to start with a balanced tempo. If I harmonize with your frequency first, I can then influence your behavior afterwards. So how do we make sure, how do we use that to our advantage but not cause it to overstimulate? We need to know a lot about what the person is experiencing, and the way that we do that, the way we get our information, is with having receptive hand positioning. So everyone's body is different. People can interact with the juggle board how they want, but as a facilitator, there is a particular type of hand positioning that's going to help you gain more sensory feedback information yourself. And at the beginning, it's hard to really be aware of this information and how you're really processing it, because we don't process it consciously. It's physical information. So I try to encourage these strategies, these techniques at the beginning, for you to just learn that behavior and then benefit from it. Because it's really hard to explain. But it's a simple idea, is you want to have receptive, right? Think of the ball of having information. And the more absorption my body takes from that ball, the more frequency, the more stimulation my brain has to harmonize with. So like you're saying, like you're not aware of each finger, it's not so important. But the idea is just to have an absorbent body position. So you need to be soft, but you also want to have control. So we find fingertips on top and thumbs in the back is really the best, because it gives me the most control. I have the most, like, I can use my fingers, I can use this, I can use my elbows, I can use my arms. So when I'm trying to produce really specific amounts of force, that position gives me a lot of options. And then also by being relaxed with my hand, because at the beginning we can tend to see people get tense. And if your hand is hard and you hit and you touch the ball's not going to give you a lot of sensory feedback information, right? It doesn't seem like that big of a deal, but we need to learn to just, always stop the ball, always collect its information, and then send it. And this is the hand positioning that we encourage you to use to do it. But again, it's not important that your students do that. We're very open to how students interact with the balls. The one thing you want to avoid the students doing, the technique we want to avoid, is if you see them put their hands under the ball to roll it, or like this, or like that, because then the balls come out. And the way I correct that behavior is with gesture as well. So the only time I'll ever tell someone to do something different with the ball is if they're using it in a way that causes it to come out. And then us as the facilitator, this is the hand position we want to start to use, because that's what's going to give us our feedback information so that we can make the changes that the student needs to have. And I compare this to like listening through your hands. It's this idea, we're learning to listen through our hands. And as Dimitri just pointed out, that with this synchronization, spontaneous synchronization, there's part of that phenomenon is increased, right? Increased influence, and it cascades. So when we harmonize with a person, they might start to get, and we did give different patterns. There's times that they might start to increase their tempo, increase their force, right? And we know that because we're interacting with these balls in a way that let me know how much force they're using, how much time they're using. As we start to, our goal throughout the facilitation is going to be to increase tempo. In most cases, it depends on who they are, but people are either going to come in at one or two tempos. They're either going to be too soft or too hard, right? People who are confused tend to be more soft, and then people who are anxious tend to be more hard. And my job in either situation is to get them to the frequency I need them to be, right? To get them to the rhythm that's going to be the most natural for them with whatever pattern we're doing. So in most situations, I'm trying to control their tempo, right? And the thing to understand here is the two main sensory stimulations we have in this synchronization. What is being synchronized? What's being synchronized is the sense of force and the sense of time. So we want to find ways to regulate those separately now, because if I increase force and time simultaneously, there's a bigger chance that you are going to become overstimulated, right? Whereas if I can find ways where I can increase tempo without increasing force, then it's able for you to not become overstimulated, right? And then after you've learned to process a higher tempo, then I can ask you to process more force stimulation. So the way that we regulate this is between the conditions of force, time, and distance. Those are the elements that we use to regulate the stimulation. Because if you amplify force, you increase the amount of energy that is in the activity, and then the person responds with more energy as well. And we are trying to keep them calm in this process, right? We're trying to seduce them into a more relaxed state of mind. So it's important that you're aware when you see that stimulation happen, and that you change your behavior so that you're not promoting it. Yeah. So similar to the way that synchronized crowds clap, I just showed you in that last slide, this is what we're talking about. So let's take a look at a video that really demonstrates how that works, because visually it's pretty simple, but the sensory ability for you to regulate, it takes practice. And the idea is we use distance. Distance becomes our regulator. If I want you to increase tempo, right, but I don't want to overstimulate you at the beginning. Let's say I tried to increase tempo and force with you at the same time, and that caused you to, start using the same hand or just become very inconsistent with your behaviors. Then what I would do in that situation is I would shorten the distance between me and you. And as I did so, I would begin to reduce the amount of force I used in proportion. So that as I'm getting closer to you, at first the tempo isn't changing, right? Because as I get closer, that should increase the tempo. But because I reduce the force, the person maintains the same tempo, but now they have to, in order to maintain that tempo, they have to reduce their force as well. So I get you to use the same tempo with less force. And then once I'm closer, then I increase the tempo. So you're using soft force and you're increasing your tempo. And when I get you to the tempo I want, then I do the reverse. I begin to increase the distance and increase the force. That's how I'm able to separate the stimulation of force and time and not cause overstimulation when I use spontaneous synchronization to influence people's behaviors. Does that make sense? We're separating those two. The thing that is being synchronized is the sense of force, which comes from touch, and the sense of time, which comes from frequency of interaction. We use distance to neutralize it. I get closer and softer, and then I pull away and I get harder. This is not a technique that you're always going to need to use, right? And it's going to be like you have to do these things to know when. But I'm telling you now, be aware. People are either going to come into the situation with too much, too fast, too much force, too much time, or too little. And now this is the tool that I have to guide them to where I want them to be, to help them harmonize their relationships. Right, okay, so that's the basics. That's the basics of our foundation. And this is gonna give us a lot, like just the ability to communicate this way, to say, because if I'm in control of the patterns, I'm in control of what interactions you're having. I'm in control of what sequences you're doing. I'm also in control of the force and the time, right? I'm in complete control of this situation. Like we're able to take all of the responsibility. And that gives us a lot, but there are situations now within the composition where we know people are going to have challenges when we're asking them to do things that this communication strategy alone isn't enough. So there are others, there are additional ones we're going to talk tomorrow, but for today and what we're doing with, this becomes the base. This becomes our means of communication. We harmonize with the participant's frequency first. We use a receptive hand positioning so we can receive as much tactile information from them as we can, because our brains need that to know how to respond. And then we regulate, we use phenomenon, spontaneous synchronization, right? We use this phenomenon of spontaneous synchronization to then influence and guide their sensory regulation, right? How they're responding to the juggling. So that's when we're doing the composition. This is the type of relationship we are forming with our students. So for a practice exercise now with your boards, this is harder to do on your own than it is with a partner, surprisingly. But we're going to start with pattern 1. I want us to do pattern 1, synchronous lateral and asynchronous lateral. And the first thing you need to do with this pattern while you're on an incline is you need to harmonize with it. So the way that's going to look if you're on an incline is it means balanced geometry. When all the objects, when the objects are always going in opposite directions, right? So as one object's coming down, there should always be one object going up. They should always be going opposite. If you have 2 objects going up at the same time and a different amount of time in between, right? Your goal should be the same amount of time between each event. In order to achieve that, you have to use sensory processing. You have to feel the force in the ball so your body can imitate that force, right? So start doing these patterns, use your eyes, find a balanced tempo first. And then once you have that, you're going to close your eyes. because this is going to make you more aware of the sensory feedback information and how you can use it to harmonize yourself. So practice pattern 1, synchronous and asynchronous. Find a balanced tempo, and then try to close your eyes and be aware of the sensory information that you have. So usually when we introduce the composition, when you have a partner, one of the best ways that we suggest people practice is with a partner, so that you can be looking as the facilitator, you can be looking at the board, and the partner can be reading you the notation at the beginning, because it really interrupts the learning process if you're having to look away from the board and then look back at the board. So what I would suggest for you guys right now is to try to write this composition down really quickly on a piece of paper in a straight line, and then put that piece of paper underneath the board so you can look at that while you're doing it. That's going to make it a lot easier to learn. So let's look at now just this section very closely one time, and then you can do it, yeah? So you have the idea is you do each pattern until you feel you've harmonized, right? Or however long you feel comfortable. Once you start to feel, a really balanced relationship with the pattern, when I'm facilitating, that's when I move on. It could be anything from 10 repetitions to 20 repetitions per pattern, depending on the person. But when you see here the transition beat, the thing that's different is you just do it one time. And it's only to get from one location, from pattern 3 into pattern 4, without losing tempo, because now we understand if you lose tempo, you lose communication, right? That's why it becomes important for us to use those beats. So I want us to just play this through. We saw with the notation already, we're going to now, we introduced the relationships with space, and we just keep reinforcing those same structures, right? In this sense, the person's not having to process new relationships. They're just having to transform, they're not having to process new sequences. They're just having to transform their relationship with those sequences. This is what I mean by conditioning and reinforcing of behavior. So we'll look at this section quickly, and we will see that it starts off with pattern 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, getting them to just alternate sides, asynchronous tempo, and then we go to pattern 2, and then that's when, now this is where we start to see the tendency for a person to use the same hand twice on the midline. So be very aware of which hand you use to touch the number 1. It should always change in that pattern. The transition here, you can write it as 15. I wrote it out in the video as 4, 1 something. You saw there. There's many ways, and later on, like after you learn this composition, what I'm showing you is like if nothing goes wrong, and then there's all these variations, you learn all these little mini compositions to make corrections, and at certain points in this composition, depending who you're working with, you can branch off into a different choreography of development and then come back in. So and that tend to do that at the places we see the errors, but that's what I mean. Like don't overanalyze the notation here, because it's more about the intention. Get from one location to another. So the transition beat you could write as 35, or I wrote it as 4, 1, 3, 5. And the idea now is you see here, now there's midline crossing. That's definite midline crossing. Look at the bottom of the notation here, where it's the pattern 4, you see it written twice, because it's the structure of the relationship that determines these patterns as well. So 4, 2, 3, 5 is the same as 4, 2, 1, 3, right? We just moved it over one spot. And the reason we do that is because we want to introduce pattern 5. And if I take pattern 4 and I slide it over, then it makes it really easy to transition into pattern 5, right? So look at how this psychology works. So I have them in pattern 4. Let's say I got that. Then I move them to pattern 4, but I slide over one position. And then if I want them to go into pattern 5, boom. When they're in pattern 4 here, every hand keeps going to the same location because it's an even period, right? So the left is always on the 4, the right is always on the 2, same position. When you add that 5th beat, watch what happens to the hands. Now it's going to be left on the 4, right on the 4, left on the 4, right on the 4. So that creates a situation when objects change hands and each hand goes to each location, right? And I also told you how our expectation is not for them to do it at this stage, but I want to make you aware of how that's working with pattern 4, what we're trying to do, and how we're getting there. Things cooler for me. So the thing I want to talk to you about the synchronous composition because it's really short. Here, this section is just about conditioning a new behavior. So the important thing is how you introduce it. We use only the 2 lanes. Watch, wait, look at when I make my movement here. That's really important, when you make your gesture. So at the beginning, I send the balls. I gesture to the person to cross their arms. They cross their arms. I send them the balls, and then I wait until they send me them back. You have to wait until they send you the balls back to make your gesture. If you make the gesture before that, they're not going to copy you. They're going to be thinking about their balls. And I see this a lot in beginners. They make the gesture while the balls are rolling to them. The person's not looking at you. They're looking at the balls. So always wait until after they send you the balls to communicate your gesture. And it just takes a couple repetitions. And then once you have that, we're really trying to get them to pattern 5. We're only using this part of the composition to introduce the bilateral behavior, which is why you don't see so many patterns. And once they have that behavior, then I want to transition it to asynchronous. So what's really nice here, we go straight from pattern 3, synchronous bilateral, into the next section, which is pattern 3, asynchronous bilateral. So that transition is so easy. If I had tried to ask the person to do that pattern with me without leading them through this way, it would be very hard and confusing because there's a lot of bilateral crossing. But because we use that, we conditioned that behavior first, and we just ask them to change the relationship with time, people do it naturally. And then once they're there, it's very easy to get them to do pattern 2 the same way. And pattern 2 bilateral is very similar to pattern 5. They don't even notice the difference when you move from pattern 2 to pattern 5. It's hard to even say which one is more complex. But if you notice here, because pattern 2, it works left to right, it goes in both directions. But pattern 5 goes in one direction. So it's after I complete one cycle, this is pattern 2, I get to the end of pattern 2 there, and then I introduce pattern 5. And they barely notice, they just follow. At this point, they're not thinking, they're just reacting. And all we've done was condition their body to understand that time changes sides. And then we manipulate the space to control their behavior or to influence their behavior. So then you see, you can get a sense now of how the compositions work in, what strategies we're going to need to develop in order to deliver it, and its structure. And again, this is like a template for you as well. I have so many variations. It's rare that I will facilitate this composition like with somebody without having to use any other choreography inside of it, but that's the beauty of it. I can have this main track. I know this is the direction I want to take everyone through. And then I can develop different strategies for people who struggle at different moments. And then I'll see someone struggle at that same moment, and I'll already know my choreography, right? Like this is the beauty of using repetition, even in our own teaching strategy. It allows us to really see what different people are struggling with when we're always the idea here is after, again, I would have gestured. The way I do it is usually I roll the balls. There's a bunch of strategies, you can use, but it's gesture. We finish pattern 5 in the fixed state. All the balls come to a stop, and then I show them how I want the balls to move. Usually I'll roll the balls to them, and then I'll use my hands to show them where I want move them again and send them back to myself. Usually that is enough to communicate what I want. Also, putting your hands in the lanes you want them to roll is helpful. Again, it's these strategies are up to you, but you want to make that as short as possible, right? Because we want to get right back into the engagement. So we do the same for when they have the 2 lanes, and we do the same when they have the 1. But the key thing to understand with the open state now is we're not focused on developing new sequencing relationships, right? We're focused on adding more motor control capacity and less time. And the way we do that is we have the objects change locations, and we add more objects. So if you want to practice these compositions now and see if you have any questions, just make sure you can work them out. And we'll just do this section here, the synchronous lateral. It's pattern 1 and pattern 2 because the structure, the orientation, the relationship of the the body sides in space is the same. The structure of interactions is the same. It's just the movement itself that we change. So one. What's interesting about this composition is you just watch how it evolves from a really simple state of interaction to a really complex, right? So you start off with pattern one. The person is asynchronous lateral, but they keep having to contact their midline, right? So it's asynchronous lateral and midline. And now it's the same thing, asynchronous lateral and midline, but you add more points of contact. So they're moving to different locations, but they keep coming back to their midline. And then that's when we ask them to cross. Then when we introduce pattern four, right there. So we increase the tempo too. The faster they're moving with these patterns, something to be aware of. Higher the tempo is, the more likely the person is going to respond without resistance. So if you can increase the tempo here, you don't want them to anticipate. If they start to think about what they want to do, they're going to make a mistake. But if you can keep the tempo so intense that they can only react, then their bodies understand this language. It's just their brains that are getting in the way. So I want to take a look at this. When you go from pattern one, it's 4 lanes. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go 4, 2, 3, 5. And it's going to be the 2 and the 3 that cross. The 2 and the 3 is bilateral. Sometimes people struggle with this. There are strategies we're going to talk about later. But a good amount of people can follow this without that. And then once they can do 2 beats to each side of the body, then we just ask them to do 3. And now we have Mills Mass. And the reason they're able to follow it this time in such a short composition is because we know in the first part of the composition, we developed all of these sequencing tasks already. So this is why we're able to sort of take that simple movement at the beginning and just explode it into something way more complicated without ever having to communicate verbally as well, right? So let's try this part of the composition. So the participant is going to always send back on the 1. That's the only thing the participant has to do. And the facilitator, you're doing 2 variations of pattern 1 using 2 lanes and 4 lanes. And then you're going to pattern 4, which is 2 beats to each side of the body. And then you do pattern 5, which is 3 beats to either side of the body. And you see those 2 variations there. It's just one has a bigger cross than the other, but it's the same sequence: left, right, left, left, right, left. But there's 2 notations there because it shows you how you can do it with a big cross and a little cross. Give that a so tomorrow we're going to look at this section a lot more because it has different learning needs, but the composition itself is really simple. We start off synchronous, and what's interesting or what you want to watch for when you first introduce it, the reason we start off with these 2 synchronous patterns is because what you see those balls do in space now, it's a visual representation of what the information has to do inside of your brain, right? So it can be common when you introduce this first exercise for the person to have their arms follow the ball. So they roll laterally, but their hand follows the ball and they do this, right? Which seems like it's more complicated, right? But in reality, let's ask ourselves, why would that happen? Why would someone not have their hands cross over rather than just receive the balls on the other side, right? Because as those balls crossed their midline in space, what the brain needed to do was exchange their information. So when you see that hand crossing over in this activity, it means they're not exchanging that information. So the hand follows the same ball, right? You see how that happened if they cross there? So in those, that's just something to be aware of and to look for. If my solution for that is to just get them to like put their hands up. I'm like, roll, put your hands up, roll, put your hands up, just to like break that temptation to cross. But that's an indication for you now. You have, all these visual indicators, different ways that we can evaluate people's performances, things to look for. And then we go to 4 balls just to teach them to now interchange between those 2 frequencies. And then after they manage that, then we go to the cascade, and it's really simple. And we're going to focus so much on these strategies tomorrow. So I'm going to move through this now because we need to talk about the flow state stimulation, right? Because assuming we facilitated this composition and that we were really sensitive and aware of our participants' experiences throughout, so that we made that learning process completely appropriate for them at every moment. and then we expose them to juggling, then there's not a probability, there is a byproduct that they will experience some sensation of flow, some state of this altered processing, right? So as discussed in the previous presentations, our experience of juggling can be defined by the state of mind which it produces, which we refer to as global activation. The behaviors of our brain and sensations of our body during a state of global activation are very similar and associated to the experiences of what we would call a flow state. Activation of a flow state can be recognized as the instant a person's frequency becomes completely harmonized with the interactions of their environment. So we're not just claiming to say that we're going to stimulate flow, right? We know that the activity we are engaged in itself tends to trigger that state of mind. And we are saying, what do I say? Activation of flow state can be recognized. So we know the activity is triggers it, right? And then we're saying that we have a feedback as well that we can indicate it. You know, we're not just imagining these ideas. Okay. All right, so this is kind of a complicated idea. There's a few things I want to share about it. I think many of us understand this intuitively and it doesn't need explanation, but there are people who are more skeptical. And even for yourself, just understanding how this works, I think it helps you exercise it better, right? So one of the ways we detect that we get an indication that a person has we've activated the flow state for them is how they respond to the learning process itself. Because what we observe really consistently in the primary composition is that there's an acceleration, that, you know, the learning development happens like this, sort of linear, and then there's a moment when the learning curve accelerates. And we detect that by how rapidly they respond to the different harmonizations of the frequencies we're sending them. At the beginning, we have to introduce them very slowly. And there's a moment when the person changes the way they're processing the information that allows them to accelerate more rapidly. And that's what we recognize in our facilitation method as being like, that's an indication that I got that person to alter their state of mind. And if I do that, I got the benefits of juggling. So in order to understand this concept in our facilitation technique, we need to be hyper aware of the zone of proximal development. So this might be a concept you're familiar with, like from an education background. If not, I'm certain if you teach circus that you use this awareness all the time. It's the basic breakdown of how education works. The idea, we call it ZPD for short, but in order to stimulate a flow state or to have quality learning experiences in general, it's necessary that we learn to appropriately manage a person's zone of proximal development. The zone of proximal development can be thought of as the distance between what a person is able to learn on their own independently versus what they are able to learn with help and versus what they are not able to learn yet, right? So this is what I mean when we apply this intuitively, yeah? If you have a beginner juggling student, you're not gonna hand them 5 balls because you know they're not ready to do that, right? But we do hand them 3 balls. And that I feel is obviously, and you know, when anytime an activity, you present a challenge that is outside someone's zone of proximal development, you are asking them to learn through a process of pure failure, which makes it a very difficult process as well. So when we're facilitating, when we begin to interact, you know, every person's going through the same pattern. They're going through the same sequencing challenges, but we are going to present it at different tempos using different forces because all of that is going to affect how the person is responding, and it's going to determine the level of challenge. So someone who sits down with me that has higher capacity, I'm going to use more intense challenge levels for them. Whereas someone who gets lower, I'm going to use lower intensity, but I'm using the same material. And this is the idea of our facilitation method. It allows us to just create an entire spectrum of learning. And we are able to put the challenge level at exactly where it needs to be for each person without stopping. And I'm able to do this as well because I'm taking their information. So this is the area that we want to focus on. Whenever we're facilitating, we're trying to figure out what level of challenge is the person able to do with me now? And then where's the limit where they're not able to do it with me anymore? So you feel that if I'm facilitating, once it reaches a level where the person starts to fail, I know I just found the limit of their zone of proximal development. So I go, you know, 2 beats slower than that, and I let them stay at that stimulation level. So it's about, we at the beginning, we're searching and allowing them to set the tempo at the beginning. They're telling us, this is my zone. This is where I'm comfortable. And then we have to explore the boundary of where they become uncomfortable. Because if we do that, or if we apply this learning model, when we apply this learning model in traditional teaching settings, we assume that it's going to be interrupted. We don't assume it's going to be fluid, meaning that like in a classical sense, I taught you how to throw the diabolo. You showed me you could do that. And then I'm going to think of another trick. Okay, now can you try to throw the diabolo and do a pirouette, right? So I create different levels of challenge, scaffolding, yes? And we know how this applies when the learning process is interrupted. But this is a learning process. We've created training wheels, right? We created that bicycle sort of environment. And what happens when a person learns a bicycle? What do we observe? At the beginning, it's really slow. And then there's that moment when they get it and it goes boom, right? They go from riding 100 feet to 300 feet to around the block without stopping. We see that explosion of learning occur there as well. Because that's an uninterrupted learning process, like juggling is going to be for us in this situation. What our expectation for these learning models, for its outcomes, the way this theory applies classically, is that it's the idea of plotting a chart between the skill level of a person and the challenge level of the activity you present, right? So if a person has a low level of skill, you need to present them a low level of challenge that's going to be within their zone of development. And a person has a high level of skill, you have to provide them with a high level of challenge. This makes sense, right? But there's something to say about what happens when you get this wrong, you know, because if you give them too much challenge, they're only going to experience failure, and that's going to cause adrenaline to be released in the brain. Yeah, they're going to have anxiety and they're going to experience failure. Adrenaline and anxiety is actually part of the formula of flow. So we are sort of intentionally trying to trigger anxiety as well. By pushing the boundary of their zone of proximal development, we keep them on the edge of their seat. They're not able to relax. They have this constant sense that things could go wrong in any moment because they're challenged to their limit. But we never allow that to happen because we're in control of the tempo. And then similarly, if the challenge level is too low, it's boredom. So we're not going to activate flow. You have to push the limit of the zone of proximal development to do that. So essentially, we're focused on the zone of proximal development as any learning model is, but us in particular, with our facilitation method, we are able to focus on the very limit of it the entire time we are engaged with the person, right? So as soon as you start engaging me and I get a sense of what your boundary is, how much you can handle, I keep you there and I don't let it drop. And as you progress, because now you're there, you're going to progress. I can sense that, I can detect that, and I can increase the challenge. So I'm always keeping you now with this facilitation method at that peak. And the difference here as well is not only are we so accurate at doing this in this situation, but we do it without interruption, which that's what makes it more like the bicycle learning process, right? Once the person starts to experience this stimulation without interruption, it changes the learning process because it stimulates flow. And then you get an outcome that looks more like this. So this is what we experience when we facilitate the primary composition. We experience an exponential learning growth where the person exhibits, you know, throughout the first part of the composition. I have to pause this because it gets too distracting for me. But it's you know, you will really understand it when you experience it yourself. You know, when you start to master the composition and you see the same pattern of behavior in everyone. The way I detect it is it tends to go at the beginning, right? You know, I find out where they are and we start to build intensity and they're handling it with me. And then I reach a point of intensity with them where they really start to struggle more. So I feel them going up and up with their progression, harmonizing more and more. And then I hit this phase with them where they really, you know, their movements start to become jerky. You know, there's a lack of control in their behavior almost. And then if I'm able to manage that well enough so that I can keep them stressed out, but not let them fail, something changes in their body. And in an instant, they go from all that resistance to just completely harmonized. Like it really just, it goes from like fire to water. Like I'm trying so hard to regulate all of their sensory feedback information. And then in an instant, they just become harmonized with me and it becomes effortless, right? That's flow. And in that moment, we need to be aware of that now as part of our teaching model. So that's cool. That's great. We know we just stimulated this altered state of mind, but that's important for us to be aware of because when we feel that, we know we need to start increasing that challenge faster and faster and faster if we want to keep them in that state of mind. You know, so at the beginning, prior to when we detect this, we're really focused on not overstimulating, right? We put so much emphasis on not overstimulating to get them to this point. But then once you're there, you have to throw everything you have at them because they just consume They just consume knowledge at that point. And this is what we need to be aware of as well. We get the exponential learning outcomes. And it's something that will not make sense until you do. But those of us who use this composition, we discuss this all the time. This is a normal occurrence. Like, oh, I wasn't able to get that person to trigger flow. How did you know that? Because they kept resisting me. Or I was able to get that person to trigger flow. How did you know that? Because they were resisting me and then they stopped. And when they stopped, they began to learn really quickly. So this is an indication that we've stimulated global activation, right? So that's what I mean by we can validate that. It's not just an imaginary claim. You know, you can disagree with me, but when you see this happen, you try explaining to me another way of what's going on. Cool. Okay. Oh no. So I was really quick with that. Okay, I managed to get through that fast. That flow state conversation, you know, we can really unpack it. And I actually have some video links, and I really encourage you guys to check out the knowledge-based playlist, because there's so many interesting things going on with the state of mind and so many directions we can apply it now. And understanding it and seeing the whole structure of the composition and everything I broke down and how it all channels in to that one stimulation. Like everything I'm doing and creating, giving people access to juggling, is to trigger that state of mind, because that is the most holistic thing we can give any other human being. Like if I give you that, it's not up to me to decide its impacts. It's you, right? It's yours. And not only that, but just like the health benefits that we need to start to focus on there. So yeah, check out the knowledge-based playlist for sure. There are quite a few videos there about flow and how it stimulates. There's theory here about how to stimulate flow as well. And there's chemical precursors, adrenaline and dopamine. So because we're facilitating the person always at that threshold, they constantly feel like they're about to fail, but we never let them do. So they're getting that conflicting chemical reaction inside of their brain, which is adrenaline and dopamine. Also novelty and unpredictability is part of flow. They don't know what's happening. We don't communicate verbally, right? Another reason it becomes important. Like we're trying to stimulate flow, then we're designing our educational model around that idea. Okay, so the review points. We introduced the primary composition today, which is intended to be delivered non-verbally and without interruption. It's designed to develop the sequencing capacities of all participants beyond that of what is needed to manage the outcomes of a 3-ball tossing cascade. So our previous expectation for a first-time experience with juggling used to be the 3-ball cascade, and we failed a lot at that. And when you teach someone to do a 3-ball cascade, you're only exposing them to one of the sequencing relationships of juggling, right? So you're not really giving them the language of juggling. Whereas in this approach, we are exposing them to the entire spectrum of sequencing relationships with juggling, and we are getting them to interchange those relationships as well. So the 3-ball tossing cascade now is like nothing. Like what outcome is that? And I'm telling you that you can do this in 10 to 12 minutes with any person. And then if you do this with them first and then you ask them to juggle, then your rate of failure goes down even lower. You know, if you do the primary composition with someone and then you take them to do the 5-step juggling method, you're going to have 100% success rate, unless that person has a physical impairment, something that prevents them, you know. These are the new realities that we have to come to terms with, right? What else? The nonverbal part, I think, is explained by this tactile communication. We talked about synchronization and how that is. It's really abstract, I know, but I think this idea of playing with your eyes closed is helpful to gain understanding, right? Anything you can do here with your eyes open, you can do with your eyes closed. All that sensory information is there. And my advice here is like, it's not something that you process. We don't process this information consciously. So it's just important to be aware that it's there. And the more you make yourself receptive to it, the easier it becomes to respond to other people. So another way to describe it is just like being open. Like just when I sit down with someone, I just take a breath and I just open myself to them. That's my strategy for the sensory, because this is what allows me to do this sensory communication and tactile management strategies, because it is so much information, all this technical. So I think what I'm trying to say is I really process it emotionally. That's how I take it. Like, you know how you feel music gives you that emotion. These frequencies that you're getting, just think of them as emotions, and then it simplifies it for your brain. I think rather than thinking about all those spatial relationships and everything, when you really get into it, that's what it comes down to. But if you do want to get technical about it, I talked about it takes practice. But if you do observe you're doing this and people are getting overstimulated, it's probably because you're increasing force and tempo at the same time. And we have a strategy to divide those, right, by shortening the distance. And we went over that, just a reminder. You'll have to watch these slides. These videos are here for you. It's so much material. I really apologize for so much material in such a short period of time, but and then the idea is that if we can put this learning model together, and we know that juggling produces flow, right? So that should be the outcome of our facilitation model. That's our goal, because that's the universal beneficial part. That's the part that doesn't relate to your skill level. So global activation and flow are unavoidable byproducts to juggling, the experience of juggling, and it is our intention to be able to trigger such conditions for all participants. And we do that now. We take that responsibility because we're able to constantly maintain the level of challenge the person is experiencing, and challenge is a big part. How long you're able to maintain peak performance is it really helps you trigger flow. And then on top of that, we are using these anti-entropic sequencing of orbital relationships, which is causing us to detach from our sense of linear time. So it becomes really clear and obvious now why juggling is such an effective tool for stimulating that, right? It's like a recipe for stimulating flow. And I don't want people to think like, oh, we are the ones doing it. You are not the ones producing flow for the other person. The person produces it for themselves as they interact with the juggling. So the real magic here is the juggling. If we have anything to thank, it is the juggling. But we have to train ourselves really hard to be able to open that up with other people this way. Cool. Homework for tomorrow, read chapters 18 and 19, which is now going to be focused on, now we're going to look at the facilitation techniques and also like that last part, that when the person becomes independent, because there's different things of us we need to be aware of and different teaching strategies as well. So we're going to focus on that last part of the composition tomorrow. And what else are we going to do tomorrow? And then also look at some teaching strategies as well, if you're interested to get into tossing, how to use this structure then to transition to tossing, and then how to use it to transition to functional, because those are the two ways we're going. For homework, practice the composition and keep practicing it. Working on an inclined plane is really good because then you don't need a partner and then you can really learn the dance yourself. And when it's on an incline, you have to be really aware of its sensory feedback as well, because you have to be super sensitive on an incline. And we use that as a teaching strategy. So using an inclined plane is a good way to practice it, but think of it as a dance, break down its parts, don't take it all on at once. Take your time with it. Like if you learn one section, then go practice that section with someone and see how it goes, and then build up as you go. But don't expect to learn it overnight. I don't know how long it takes. I can't tell you that. I don't have a feedback from people to say like, oh, 15 hours of practice. It depends on you. I know it takes practice. That's what I hear people tell me. But I know the results of that practice are transformative. Will transform your career. So it's worth the time.